Great turnout. Well, it will be very budget efficient for us, and you'll find out later why. But no spoilers yet. So I can't get no client satisfaction, and as Mick Jagger once famously said. But enough of that. Let's get serious. So what we wanted to talk about today is oh yeah, I forgot about that. How to measure client satisfaction. And Joe and me, my colleague Joe, we have been working on this for a while now. We've been researching how can we best measure client satisfaction. And today we would like to share some of those insights that we gained, the research that we did, and basically lessons learned from that with you. And hopefully you guys can take something home with that and maybe apply this method yourself. Anyway, first of all, I'd like to introduce myself. So, like I mentioned, this is my colleague Joe. He's a movie industry veteran. He worked in studios that have won Oscars for best graphics effects and worked on movies like Avengers, Blade Runners, the new one, the most recent one that is, and Interstellar. And within Wargaming, she has been working on big world tech and machine learning, so game supporting tech. As for me, I'm Jerry. I used to be a producer at Donkey Crew in the UK. That was an indie studio that we started with about 10 people and has now grown to about 50 or 60. Since joining Wargaming, I've worked on Tank Commander, which is event mode within World of Tanks console. It recurs every month for a week, and it has had 380,000 unique players since it started. Also, I've been working on game concept prototypes within Wargaming. And yeah, we're both from Wargaming Sydney. We're both project managers. And to introduce the company, for those who don't know much about it, we're about 100 people working on game projects and game tech, like our portfolios kind of indicate. We've been working a lot on game supporting tech in the past, and now also transitioning towards more game projects. And anytime you're in the area, anytime you're in Sydney, feel free to hop by and come see us. As for content of this presentation and what to expect, we'll start with why is this interesting? Because pretty dry topic, right? You see the turnout. Not many people here, but this is actually interesting for a lot of different game development companies, either for us, AAA, or for indies, but I'll go more into that later. We'll talk a bit about our research, what research we did, what learnings we have from there, and like to share some of those findings. Also, we'll move on to how to measure satisfaction, and then Joe will take over and she will talk more about what we should measure and what we learned from putting it into practice and if it actually works. So that's what you can expect from this talk. Let's get started. So, like I announced, let's start with why is this interesting. It is a dry topic, but why it is actually interesting is we formulated it as a studio goal for ourselves, and that was our main goal for starting this research. As Wargaming Sydney, we work with a lot of studios across the globe, and also we have our headquarters, obviously. And if those are very satisfied with us, they are very trustworthy of our studio, that means we get new opportunities. We might get to be more autonomous. We might get the first pick of what project we want to work on. And for that reason, it's important towards achieving our studio goals, and that's also why it got in there. So improving the satisfaction level of key stakeholders within Wargaming was one of our studio goals. And defining that goal and wanting to improve it, Peter Drucker once said, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. So what that meant for us is we needed to start with actually measuring the satisfaction level of our clients. But it's not just relevant for us. So we do a lot of code development, and we're in a AAA environment. But like I said earlier, I used to work in an indie studio. And in that indie studio, we had a publisher, we had investors. And even in that situation, it's really vital that those key stakeholders and clients are happy with what you're doing. For instance, your publisher, they control your marketing budget, right? If they have a lot of faith in the project that you're building in your studio as a whole, they might actually increase that marketing budget, and your game, as a result, will be more effective. Same for an investor. If they're really happy with the work you're doing, they might increase their investment. They might further invest in your studio, and thus you can expand what you're doing. Or alternatively, if you're running late on a deadline, they might actually be okay with you delaying that deadline a bit because they have full trust in what you're doing and they know you know what you're talking about. So that's pretty much why is it useful. I hope that's clear for everyone. And then on to our research. How did we start? We first formulated our objectives, and the first objective we had was to find out how our clients perceive us in an unobtrusive and natural manner. The reason for this being the key decision makers that you want to know the satisfaction level of. They're often very high level people, very busy people, and if you start surveying them a lot, it actually achieves the opposite. They will get annoyed with you, they will become less satisfied. So our main first objective was, if we want to measure this, we want to do it in a way that is unobtrusive and natural. Objective number 2, to have reliable metrics to inform a judgment on the current satisfaction level of key influencers and clients. So if we want to measure this, we want to make sure that the metrics we get are reliable and we can actually do something with them because we know they are reliable. If we measure this but we're not certain about the reliability, we can start acting upon them, but it might actually be the wrong thing we're doing because the metric wasn't reliable enough. Third objective, to formulate insights from metrics and observations and act accordingly to improve. So we don't want to just measure it, we want to actually get direction for what can we do better. I think within the studio we all have quite an improvement mindset, and for that reason we don't want to just know, we want to know what can we actually do with it. What can we improve? And that's basically how we started. We started with interviews. We started within the studio asking about potential problem areas, what we have learned from previous things, what people would be open to try, what people wouldn't be open to try. And then we looked into industry best practices. We'll talk more about that. We looked into literature research. There's a lot of research onto customer satisfaction and all these kind of things. And we also have our own BI and research department within Wargaming, which helped us, and we collaborated with while doing this research. So much for the research we did. That was basically how we approached this thing. And the first question we asked ourselves is basically, how do we want to measure this? And based on the literature that we reviewed, a lot of it pointed towards a survey. So we started looking to maybe we should do a survey. But surveys also have their challenges and their limitations. And to demonstrate these, we would like to make it a bit interactive, so if everyone could get their phone out and connect to the internet. We have a special kind of interactive thing set up. And to tie into one of the studio initiatives that we run here, there's an initiative that for every person who visits a link that we have to the career page, there's a tree being planted. And for every person who answers the survey that we're going to do, we'll also plant the tree, so you guys can contribute to a better environment. But let's get to it. This is the URL I asked you guys to go to. So that's tiny.cc GCAP1. And the question that you'll find there is, are you bored yet? And then you have two options, yes or no. This should be a live result, so I think everyone is still typing. Ah, there we see. So three votes. Oh, we have a great participation rate. I think we almost have everyone here. Wow. Okay, so 8 votes for no, 9 votes for no. Anyway, so 9 trees, but let's see. So most of you voted no, and that is a great example of a survey challenge number 1, and that is candor. So if you don't have the most close relationship with someone, it might mean that you don't have the most trust between you, and you don't have candor to say exactly what you mean. For instance, if I think someone is not doing a great job, but I don't have that personal relation with them, I might dull it down a bit, and I won't honestly say what my opinion is. And I think this is a great example of it, because no way you guys are not bored yet. I mean, we have this satisfaction thing. No one finds that interesting. So, point proven. Candor isn't great yet. We need to get to know each other better. Survey challenge number 2. Can you guys all go to the same URL, but instead of GCAP1, GCAP2? So tiny.cc/GCAP2. And the question you'll find there is, what do you think about World of Tanks? A, love it. B, like it. C, meh. Or D, hate it. Oh, most people are quite indifferent. Some like it. Wow, 10 votes, we're going up, 10 trees. Ah. Okay, so as you can see, there's some differences. Some people are quite indifferent, some people like it, some people hate it. Unfortunately, no World of Tanks lovers, oh well. But that proves the point of survey challenge number 2. There's personality and cultural differences in how people judge things. So one example we work with a studio in North America, we work with a studio in Eastern Europe. Americans, they find anything awesome. They will always say, oh, this is great. And whereas Russians, if they say, oh yeah, this was all right, we didn't have a problem with that, that might actually be just as good as that American saying it was awesome. And you can say see the same for World of Tanks. In Australia, there's not a huge following for World of Tanks. But for instance, in Eastern Europe and Russia, there's very much a military culture, and World of Tanks is huge there. And that might have to do with that military culture and some cultural differences. And the same goes for personality differences. Some people might be more skeptical, some people might be very positive in the way they answer things. So that's another challenge for surveys. You might not always be able to interpret the data the same. Survey challenge number 3. So this is the last one. We'll have one later on, but for now this is the last one. Tiny.cc/GCAP3, and the question you'll find there is, are you tired of survey questions yet? So A, very much so, please for the love of God stop asking. B, just a little, or C, bring on more questions. I kind of spoiled it by saying that this is the last one, but oh well. Yeah, lots of questions. Again, point proven, people have different opinions, right? So most of you say bring on more questions. Some have a little bit of tiredness for surveys, but it's very spread. So that again proves the previous point, but that wasn't why we asked this question. The main question here is survey fatigue. So generally, if you start doing a lot of surveys, people become frustrated with them, they become annoying, the response rate goes down, the quality of your data goes down because people find them annoying and they find it taking a lot of time. And we want to avoid that. Like, our aim is to improve satisfaction, not actually decrease it. And we also want to have reliable data. So for those reasons, those are some of the challenges. So those were the first 3 challenges. The 4th one we identified was project success is not equal to client satisfaction. So if you want to start measuring these kind of things, it's very easy to start looking at things like, did we deliver in time? Did we stay on budget? And those kind of things. But those don't necessarily equate directly to client satisfaction. I can deliver my project a little bit too late, but if it's really high quality or if the time didn't matter that much, my client might still be very satisfied. And for that reason, they are very closely related, but they're not the same. And we wanted to really make the distinguishment and really start measuring satisfaction rather than project success. The 5th challenge we identified was the availability of clients and stakeholders. Like I mentioned previously, a lot of these high-level players are very busy, very high-level players. And those are the key people you want to know their opinion of, but they also are not very available. They are very busy, and we don't want to mess with them. So those are the challenges. We know we keep them in the back of our mind. We're going to address them. But let's ask ourselves the next question, and that is who to survey. So we spoke about client satisfaction, and we basically broke that down into 3 groups. Users, so that could be players of your game, that could be users of your software, think in that kind of region. And there's a lot of research on those, like customer satisfaction and player surveys, that kind of thing. But that's not necessarily what we're interested in this case. We really want to focus on stakeholders and key influencers, because those are the ones that make decisions on, are they going to extend your contract, or is this investor going to invest more in my company? And for those reasons, we really focus on those. The stakeholder being the main decision maker, and the key influencer more the person you are working with on a day-to-day decision. So think of a stakeholder as a studio head, the one that you don't interact with on a day-to-day basis, or your key investor. And the key influencers, those being the producers you talk with or interact with on a day-to-day basis, or for instance, the tech lead that you work with. And those basically, because they work on a day-to-day basis with you, they will forward their information to the key stakeholders, and based on that, a decision is drawn. And we're interested in both, because, for instance, if a tech lead is very happy with you, but their producer isn't, that could give you a direction of where you can improve. If your tech is great, then okay, your health of code base most likely will be fine. But maybe you did something in the delivery or the communication that was worse, or that you could improve upon. So that's so much for who to survey, then on how and when to ask. So we want to keep the survey short. For obvious reasons, we went over it. We don't want to be too obtrusive. We want to do the survey quarterly. The reason for that, we don't want to do it more often. Then again, you get survey fatigue and negative side effects. But quarterly is a nice time that you can still check trends over time. So you can see how you're evolving over time and if you're doing good and improving on the things you would want to improve upon. Furthermore, we want to do it at natural points in time. So that could be after a milestone or a delivery or at the end of a project. These are natural points of feedback, and thus it's less obtrusive to ask. Third point, there's different skills for different cultures. So if you do a survey, you can have the answers from 1 to 5 or from 1 to 10, and they work differently in different cultures. So for instance, in Russia or Australia, 1 to 5 works well, and in China, 1 to 10 works well. There's a variety of reasons for this, one being educational systems and how grading is handled in them, and what people grow up with. But you can just look it up online and it will tell you what is the best skill for a specific country. Also, surveys should not be anonymous. This seems quite obvious. If you get the feedback, you want to know where it comes from so you can work on it. And lastly, the person with the most affinity and glue should be the one asking the questions. The reason for that is we previously spoke about candor, now it's a challenge. If I have someone I interact with and work with on a day-to-day basis, I'm much more likely to tell them more elaborately on what they could improve, or much more honest. I've built up much more glue and candor with them. So that's one of the guidelines we set while doing this. Next thing we asked ourselves is how to ask. So you have the digital survey and the in-person survey. Both have their strong points. For instance, for digital surveys, you have no influence from the interviewer because the questions are asked in a standardized way. You don't have the bias from someone asking or guiding the questions. Also, there's freedom to choose a time and place, so it's more convenient for them, and it provides an opportunity to better formulate their answer. So you can think it over again and maybe adapt your answer to be more informative. The in-person survey has a few other key benefits, and those are that you have full participation and attention of the respondent. So if it's difficult to get them to respond, this is the way to go. We did this, for instance, with some of those really high-level people. If you have a natural point of feedback, we asked them to do the survey and just did it in person. Also, you have the ability to follow up or clarify if some of the questions don't come across well, or the answers alternatively. You can observe non-verbal or emotional behavior, so you get a little bit more information. In general, what we were recommended and what we does recommend you as well is, if it's possible, use a digital survey because it's very objective in the data that you get. But in some practical cases, like I previously referenced, in-person surveys are the way to go just because they are easier to get good data for. Now I'd like to give the word to Jo. She will talk more on what to measure.
Thanks, Jerry. So in this section, I'm going to be talking about what to measure. So I'm going to be covering certain topics that we came across in our research. And those were the topics that really sort of inspired us to come up with the methodology that we came up with in the end. There's already lots of good research out there, so we didn't really want to reinvent the wheel as such. So the first concept I'm going to talk about is something called anchoring vignettes. Now I'm not going to read out exactly what this technical description is on the screen. What it essentially is a method to adjust for non-comparability in survey results. So as Jerry spoke about earlier, there's lots of personality and cultural differences that come into play. And this thing called anchoring vignettes is something that could address that. So what it is a series of usually brief hypothetical scenarios that get asked before a survey is done. And then based on the answers to those hypothetical scenarios, the rest of the answers following in that survey are calibrated based to those scenarios. So it's used a lot in things like sort of medical surveys where something arbitrary like ratings of pain is where, like, someone's version of a 7 for pain is someone's version of a 4 for pain. So how do you actually compare that kind of thing? And to demonstrate this, I'm going to ask you to get your phones out one last time, last time. And if you go to tiny.cc/GCAP4, and this is an example of an anchoring vignette or one of those scenarios. So in this scenario, it is a project is delivered on time but was 20% over budget. All requirements were met, but there were a few bugs. Is this project A, very successful, B, somewhat successful, C, unsuccessful, or D, very unsuccessful? So let me get the results. For a bit of time. Bring the results up. I think that's everyone. Oh, there's one. So there's one unsuccessful. Oh, there's a couple more different ones. So as you can see here, there is some variation in how people perceive certain situations. And as such, from there we can use that information to calibrate or put an anchor to the rest of the answers from the survey.
And one thing that might be nice to add is everyone here has an Australian culture, right? Or somewhat Australian culture. So or most of you. So we expect somewhat similar results, but if you would ask the same question to an American and a Russian, for instance, you would expect completely different
answers, yeah. So moving on, the next concept, we have the net promoter score. So I think a lot of you will probably be already familiar with this. So this is a concept that's used a lot in marketing or even game sort of player feedback gathering. And very simply, it is a question that asks that is asked, how likely are you to recommend this product or service? And on a scale of 1 to 10, if you pick 9 or 10, you're a promoter. If you're 7 to 8, you're a passive. And then from 6 and below, you're a detractor. And then to calculate this, it's very simply just the percentage of promoters you have minus the percentage of detractors that you have, which gives you the net promoter score. So this was a concept that we thought was really interesting because mainly of its simplicity, it gets the sentiment across in one very simple to-the-point question. And the next concept I'm going to be talking about is something called the trust equation. So there is a book called The Trusted Advisor, which is more sort of leadership management related. But in that book, it talks about a way to measure trust. And to break down that equation, we have credibility. So that is sort of your reputation, your credentials, how well you're perceived in terms of expertise. And if you add that to reliability, so that is how when you do what you say you're going to do and do that reliably each time, or do that consistently, plus intimacy. So intimacy in this context is how comfortable you are with someone to confide something with them. And this, the biggest factor in this equation is self-orientation, which is why that's divided by it. So self-orientation is essentially the opposite of being customer-focused. So if you are giving up for the perception that you have the customer's best interest at heart, then they are more likely to trust you rather than showing that you have your own self-interest at heart. So what I personally really like about the trust equation is that it gives you sort of a breakdown or a framework to identify areas that you can improve on. Whereas earlier, like in the Net Promoter Score, it was just one question and you don't really get too detailed into that. But here, for example, if you know that you're not rating that well on credibility, then that's something that you can work on. You know, you could get accredited or spend a bit of marketing on, you know, promoting the expertise that you already have in-house. And then lastly, to bring sort of all that research together, we came across something called the Customer Loyalty Measurement Framework, which is a bit of a mouthful. And this framework talks about, I guess, plotting different ways of measuring customer loyalty against some different axes. So we have different types of loyalty, so divided by emotional, so that's feelings-based, and behavioral, which is actions-based. And then you plot that against different types of metrics. So objective metrics is hard data, any numbers you can get, and subjective data such as from survey results. And you can see here what this framework provides is are basically metrics you can gather based off advocacy, retention, and purchasing. And what we liked about this framework was that it gives a really holistic picture. So it's not just looking at something like the Net Promoter Score, which is included in here as a subjective metric of likelihood to recommend, but it also includes sort of hard data of are you actually getting new customers, whereas the likelihood to recommend is basically an intent. And then you get that sort of translated into actual new customers. And now that I've gone through some of the concepts that we were inspired by, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how you could put this into practice. So it's 3 easy steps. Firstly, we calibrate with the anchoring vignettes we talked about. Then secondly, we measure with objective and subjective data. And then we bring that all together into something we're calling the client health check. So to calibrate for the anchoring vignettes, these are 3 scenarios that we came up with. And you can see there that each of the scenarios have different variables, but the variables are still only a little bit different. They're not too extremes because we're after trends and not and sort of specific nuances rather than sort of big variations. And we asked each of our clients this question at the start of the survey and got them to rate these scenarios based on their expectations level. And now it's really important to frame this in expectations because everyone's expectations is a little bit different. Just as a personal example, you know, coming from a stereotypically Asian household, when I came home with an exam of like 90%, my parents would be asking, where's the other 10%? Whereas I know in other households, you know, that might be a really great result. So expectations can differ quite a lot. And then now that we've got calibrated and we've got that baseline, we can start gathering metrics. So objective metrics we can obtain are things like purchasing. So the biggest one there is how much budget your client has invested in you, followed by any retention metrics you might have. So whether any of that budget they've invested was already renewed or you've got contract renewals coming up, and also looking ahead as to what future business or what future projects you may potentially have lined up with this client and the percentage of those projects that actually land. And it's important to note that these metrics are specifically indicators of client satisfaction and not project success metrics, as you could have a project that's running really over budget and really late, but your client could still be fairly happy for other reasons. And moving on to subjective metrics, we've come up with some satisfaction survey, which I'll go through the specific questions of in the next slide. So that measures for trust and advocacy. But what we also do is we collect general comments and feedback throughout the time that we are actually working with our clients. So that just gives us some extra data points that we can reflect on in future. And we don't just survey the main client or the sponsor. We look at any other key stakeholders or influencers around that client, again, so that we can build up a more holistic picture of where that client is at. And now this is the actual 6 questions that we ask in the survey that we came up with. So we managed to keep it fairly succinct. And you can see the first 4 questions are directly related to the trust equation that I spoke about earlier. So the first question is, Wargaming Sydney are good at what they do, which is related to credibility. Wargaming Sydney deliver on their commitments, which is reliability. Wargaming Sydney can be confided in, which is intimacy. And Wargaming Sydney have my best interest at heart, which is the self-orientation question. And then to finish it, we have the Net Promoter Score question about likelihood to recommend, followed by an open-ended elaboration question. And what we found was having that one please elaborate question at the end was sufficient. If you ended up having one of those per question, you would just get a really long survey that people would find it more tiresome to engage with. And once we sent out those surveys, we bring them together in something we call a client health check. So at Wargaming Sydney, we do squad health checks and quality health checks. So that's a concept that our studio are pretty familiar with. But in this case, it's essentially a big spreadsheet. So in that spreadsheet, it takes the results from the surveys and calibrates them based off the anchoring vignettes that we asked earlier. And then those results are grouped by influencers and then by projects, and then that rolls up to the main key client, which is in our case the sponsor. And then this health check, as Jerry has mentioned before, the data is actually updated at natural points in time, so on milestones or anything like that, so that it feels more unobtrusive to the client. But what we do is we review that data quarterly to sort of track trends over time, and also identify action items for sort of areas that we would like to improve on. So we do the review as a quarterly cadence, but the metrics might come in any time within that quarter. And I know the key question people are thinking, does this actually work? So I'm going to talk you through some of the results we gathered and some of the lessons learned we gained from this, from putting this into place. So when we first started this effort, we did a trial where we tried to predict what our client survey results would be. So in this case, sort of the top row is what we guessed, and the second one is what the client actually came back with. So as you can see here, for the positive and negative anchoring vignette, the client was actually more positive than we thought they would be. So that was a little bit of a surprise. But a thing to note is that for the positive anchoring vignette, our guess of a 4 was equivalent to their 5. So you can see here when we apply that to the other factors of trust, so credibility, intimacy, and self-orientation. Actually, when we run the calibration there, our guess is the same as their answer for that instance. But the interesting to note is then actually it's reliability that subtly changes after the calibration. So after the calibration, the client's data for reliability is lower than what we thought. And because we had that open-ended question, we managed to get a comment back from that client to corroborate this. So they explained a little bit to why they thought we were lacking a bit in the reliability area. And that brings us sort of to the first lesson we learned. So even though you think you know what your clients think, but you don't actually. So we capture some subtle nuances that that the anchoring vignettes actually exposed, which was great. And we didn't know our clients as well as we thought we did. And the next set of results, so these are actually calibrated results. With these projects, we can't tell you exactly what they are, but we can tell you that they are based in Europe and North America and the CIS, so we're working with clients from those regions. And in this, if we look at the raw data for trust, so we can see for Europe, it's lagging behind at 8.5, whereas in North America and the CIS went with the scores of 14. But then when we apply the calibration to those results, we can see that that alters the actual results pretty drastically. In this instance, you can see where the North Americans who were, originally, super positive, that kind of got marked down. So actually they're on the lower end of the scale. And then the Europeans went sort of 9.6. And actually with the CIS region, that went up by quite a lot. So that's the second lesson we learned. The calibration makes a whole lot of difference. I think going into this exercise, we didn't think it would make that much difference, but it did, which I think shows that it is actually working. And then the third lesson we learned is to prep the interviewers well. We found in some instances where the interviewers had not framed what this survey exercise was about, that the data we were getting back was not very meaningful. So in one specific instance, someone, I think, responded straight down the middle for everything, including the anchoring vignettes, which made absolutely no sense. So we had to invalidate that data. And since then, we've gone to some effort to try and standardize that process a little bit more so we can protect against that in the future. And then the fourth lesson learned is picking the time to deploy the survey is really, really important. We talked about sending out the survey after a major milestone, so something like a big release. But what you don't want to do is to send out that survey too close to that big release, because your client's feelings at that time could be at an extreme of either, even if it's positive or negative. So you want to wait a little while after that they've cooled off a bit to get an idea of what they're feeling, because we're after a trend and not an extreme. So we recommend waiting a little while after a big milestone, but not too long, because if you wait too long, then it it starts feeling unnatural. And then the last lesson learned is not everyone can be surveyed. So we had one particular client who was sort of super high level and super busy, and we just didn't feel comfortable getting them to do the survey. So for that person, we just need to find other ways to measure their satisfaction level, whether that's by surveying the people around him, so the stakeholders and influencers, or maybe finding a proxy for that person that we could survey instead. And that brings us almost to the end. So in terms of key takeaways, I hope most of you have maybe learnt something new, or maybe have gotten some ideas to take back with you to the studios that you're working at. Particularly, we've gone through the process to measure client satisfaction. So by calibrating with the anchoring vignettes, measuring with objective and subjective data, and then taking that data and actually reviewing that and drawing action items or areas that you could improve on. And if you can take away a second thing from this, surveys do actually work if you're trying to measure client satisfaction, but you do have to try to do them at natural points in time and do them unobtrusively by keeping the survey short. try and mitigate for any biases, so either so that the interviewers don't influence the results too much, or also by calibrating with anchoring vignettes. And then if you specifically survey for trust and advocacy over things like project success, that actually does work. Thank you. So I think there are some time for questions.
Yep.
So I think we should have 10 minutes.
Yeah, we have 10 minutes exactly.
Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
Because the survey wasn't anonymous, so you knew who all the responses were coming from. Did you find that you maybe had a tendency to put more weight on the responses from someone who was maybe a bit more senior, a bit more of a decision maker, or did you try to just evaluate everyone equally?
In the spreadsheet, I think we do have everyone sort of categorized by the main client, but all their results are there. We don't boil them down to a single number, or we display all the results basically.
Yep.
Is the answer to your question.
If someone who's a key decision maker has said something, that's maybe a little on the negative side, but then 3 people around them have all been positive, how do you balance that out?
So in that instance, that would be a great thing to dig further into. So it's not, I don't think if that came up, I don't think we'd take that at face value. We'd use that as something to spark a bit of an investigation and, speak to people to find out why exactly that is. Is there a disconnect, or is one person right and the other person is sort of on another planet, so to speak. So.
And we have been analyzing the averages of studios to compare, like you saw in the one. That's just the average over everyone, not preferring anyone putting more weight on one person. But obviously, if you start looking at the data, you put more emphasis on maybe the studio head, or hey, this CTO was quite unhappy. Let's dig into that. So there, you definitely look at the data and start thinking about it, start analyzing it. But we also use some metrics that are just averages of the whole studio. So I think it's a combination. Any other questions?
I think for like large groups, it might make sense, but in this case, our client base is fairly small. So like we know all of them by name. It's not like it's a big data set. But sorry, Jerry, did you want to say something?
We haven't done it, and I don't necessarily know how much value that would be in this case, because we want to really try to action it and see where it comes from to derive what we can do about it. If we would do it anonymous, we might get more honest answers, and for those averages like we talked about for the average studio thing, that might be good. But I think the value we lose is more than the value we gain by doing that. There was another question?
Yeah, two if I may. So how much following up do you do on this kind of thing? Like will you follow up directly with someone on the results that they give you, and use it as essentially the opening to a conversation if there's issues? And the other one was how high up kind of do you go from where you are? So if you're a client of a large company, you probably have contact with your person. Do you go to that person's boss as well as your thing?
Yeah, so to answer the first one, that's actually funny that you mentioned it, because we went over the results a while back, and one of the things that came up, we didn't know about this, we should follow up on that. So in some cases we do follow up with the stakeholder that we interviewed, but in most cases we just use the data internally and try to move forward with that. We have some things, for instance, some comments that came back, but I don't think it's part of the standard thing to get back to them on these kind of things. But we try to make improvements internally. But like I said, there are some exceptions where we went over the results and suddenly say we should follow up on that. Why is this the case, or why is that the case? And what was your second question again?
How high up do you go?
Oh yeah.
So do you go above your highest contact?
So in the studios we work with, I guess the highest we can go is the studio head, and we have been including those in the surface. There was for instance, we have 3 examples here, and of those 3 examples, we did 2 studio heads, and in the third one we didn't. That was the exception that Joe mentioned. Higher than that can't really go in this case. We don't do it with our CEO of the whole Wargaming Global, for instance, but we do it with the people we are directly involved with.
Yep, cool.
5 minutes left. All right. Any other questions? If not, I checked the results. There are about 10 responses per question, so 43s. Woo! Anyway, if that's all, then thank you all for coming. Have a good day. Oh, and you can contact us here, or see the site, or Twitter, or things.
Yeah, feel free to come and have a chat with us as well if you have any thoughts or questions. Happy to follow up.